They told me that I should be grateful, that I should smile more often, speak in a soft voice, and keep my head low, because people like me, people born in neighborhoods where there are more sirens than lullabies and dinner is served with a prayer instead of a guarantee, should not have gotten here, into these rooms with white walls and even wider stairs, not into operating rooms, where every heartbeat rests in your hands, and certainly not in the family photo albums of people whose names are printed on the walls of museums and on political fundraisers, but I did. And the real story began not in the boardroom or the hospital corridor, but the moment I reached for the hand of the woman I love and realized that even love needs anesthesia when you cut too close to the bone. I'm Marcus Reed, 31, trauma surgeon, born and raised in the South Bronx, raised on stale textbooks, devotion to the corner store, and a mother who stitched up half a block away from nursing school because hospitals didn't come on call until someone was bleeding enough to stain the sidewalk. My dad? Gone before I even had shoes on, leaving us with only his name and a toolbox. So my mom worked double shifts and taught me how to sew up oranges while her hands shook with fatigue, but her eyes never blinked, never softened. Never let me forget that my mind was sharper than any scalpel I'd ever pick up. I didn't fall in love easily. Years spent as a philanthropist with a stethoscope had accustomed me to keeping my heart under lock and key, but then she came into my life, not a patient, not even a peer, but a question I myself didn't know I was waiting to answer. Claire Anderson, museum curator, Columbia graduate, daughter of Senator William Anderson, whose smile raised millions for causes that I would never have been invited to support, and whose family crest was older than the hospital where I worked. We met not in a ballroom or at a charity event, but in the emergency room where I was removing glass from a baby's belly after the chaos of a gallery opening. And she was the only one still trying to calm the crowd while everyone else reached for their PR teams. Claire wasn't like the others. She didn't flinch when I barked an order. She didn't blink when blood splattered on my clothes. She stayed until the baby was stabilized, and then she handed me a cup of coffee with both hands and said, "You didn't even hesitate." And for a second, I forgot we were from different galaxies, because in that moment her eyes weren't assessing the grit under my fingernails. They were memorizing the rhythm of my breathing. We talked first once, then again and again, in late-night restaurants where the waiters knew me by name. Then during lunch breaks in hospital cafeterias and slow walks through botanical gardens where she laughed at the fact that I memorized Latin plant names the way I memorize arteries, and then I realized I wasn't just falling, but unraveling, string by string, in front of a person who wasn't asking me to be less. But even then I should have known that love doesn't always soften the landing. I soon met her family, or rather, I walked into their heritage museum, where every wall whispered of old money and every picture frame held a portrait of what they thought the world should look like. And spoiler, I wasn't in the picture. Senator Anderson greeted me like a donor he didn't particularly trust, a firm handshake, a thin smile, a gaze scanning my watch as if checking to see if I'd earned it or borrowed it. And his wife Margot looked at me like I was just another installation in one of Claire's exhibitions. Interesting, maybe even thought-provoking, but out of place. "Claire speaks very highly of you," Margot said, her voice like the coldness of untouched porcelain. "You must be very determined to go this far." The pause before "very determined" said it all. At dinner, the knives were silver, the glances sharper. Questions about my schooling, my neighborhood, my inspiring journey were disguised as politeness, doused in curiosity but served with suspicion. And when her cousin asked if I felt pressured, being the only representative of my background in such a high-profile sphere, I smiled because I knew what he meant. Not black but poor, not a surgeon but a survivor. And Claire's hand under the table trembled slightly as she drew a circle on my palm. A silent apology for something her family refused to say out loud. But I didn't walk away. I didn't flip out. Because I've held open chests in my hands, I've seen lives hanging on by seconds, and I know that the deepest wounds aren't always visible. Sometimes they're hidden behind smiles, glasses of wine, and the quiet click of a pearl earring when someone tilts their head and says, "You speak very well." And this was just the beginning. The night I proposed, it wasn't all rainbows and pageantry, champagne fountains and fireworks reflecting in the rooftop pool. It was just us. Just Claire and me on the back steps of the trauma center where I'd spent 12 hours removing a bullet from a teenager's lung, and my clothes were still damp at the collar, and when I took the ring out of my coat pocket, no velvet box. Just skin-heated metal and trembling fingers. She didn't cry, but laughed, gleefully and radiantly, the kind of laugh that rebuilds the heart, and said yes, as if she'd waited a lifetime for the question, not the ring. But joy, like anything precious, attracts attention. And with attention comes expectation, and expectation is something her parents were experts at. The invitation to dinner came in the form of a call from her mother's assistant, not a warm voice, but a schedule, a directive, an itinerary, and I had to realize that this was not just a dinner, but an evaluation, a measured dissection of who I was, what I represented, and most importantly, what I did not represent. When we arrived at Anderson Manor, all those stone columns, manicured hedges, and the silence that money can buy, where birdsong sounds as rehearsed, I felt Claire squeeze my hand lightly, the way she looked forward, the way her jaw set, and I realized that even she, so fierce, knew that this house could hurt. Margot met us at the door in a bone china-colored silk blouse, her smile as fragile and polished as a realtor showing a house she'd never lived in, and when she leaned over to kiss Claire on the cheek, her eyes slid over me with the precision of a customs agent inspecting foreign goods and stopped long enough to notice my suit not off the rack, but not hers either. "Marcus," she said with the calmness of a man testing the waters before entering them, "you look so calm." Claire had always liked poise, equilibrium, the word you use when you mean contrast but want to sound kind. Inside, the dining room sparkled with silver, candles, and portraits, not family photos, but oil paintings of ancestors who had sailed on ships, signed bills, and shaken hands with presidents. Their gazes were heavy, omnipresent, as if they were there to control the conversation. Senator Anderson entered last, as if to reassert his role as the final authority, and when he shook my hand, he did so with the calculated firmness of a man who had built his reputation by convincing people to believe in things they didn't understand. "Marcus," he said my name curtly, with restraint, "I've heard a lot about you. Harvard Medical, chief resident under 30, impressive." And then, after a pause too long to be accidental, he added, "It's nice to see someone using their past as fuel rather than a crutch." Claire's jaw twitched, her fingers clutching tighter to mine under the table. Dinner had begun. Lamb, roasted root vegetables, exquisite sauces poured with precision, and conversation so polished it felt like walking barefoot on glass. Questions about my education disguised as compliments, questions about my family as curiosity, questions about my intentions as interest. At one point, Margot leaned over to me and said, "The way you've risen to the occasion is admirable." Claire has always been attracted to stories of perseverance. I smiled without showing my teeth. "Perseverance builds character," I said, "but it doesn't build walls between people. You need fear for that." And then came the moment I had been waiting for. Senator Anderson folded his napkin, cleared his throat in that congressive way that signals seriousness, leaned forward exactly enough to invade the space between us, and said, "Marcus, I want to ask you man to man. Do you really believe that your worlds can merge? I mean, you've worked hard, no one doubts that, but legacy is a delicate thing. Claire's life is woven into something very ancient, very exquisite, and I worry that, not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually your differences will begin to feel like distance." Claire froze. I felt her pulse quicken. My hands remained still. "My world is not the one she visited," I said quietly. "It's the world she chose to live in." Silence. Margot sipped her wine. Claire was silent. She stood. A chair creaked on the marble. Her voice was calm, but harsh enough to make the blood rush. "You invited him here to condemn him, not to get to know him. You wanted to see how far he would bend to make you comfortable. But he didn't bend. And I will no longer apologize for loving someone who doesn't need your approval." The silence that followed was not empty. It was simmering, energizing, awe-inspiring. We left without dessert. But outside, under the moonlight, her hand still in mine, Claire whispered, "They'll try again. They always do." And I nodded, but not with fear, but with confidence. "Let them try," I said. And the war quietly began. And so Claire and I started preparing for the wedding. But surprises awaited us at every turn. It started small, a delay here, a missed call there, a reservation mysteriously canceled at the last minute, a florist forgetting about an order even though the deposit had already been paid, a wedding planner suddenly no longer available for family reasons. And even though no one said it out loud, no one needed to, because the meaning of every lost confirmation, it was sabotage, not the messy, emotional kind that comes with yelling and slamming doors, but the calculated destruction of comfort, the slow strangulation of joy until love itself became like resistance. Claire tried to stay calm, tried to fix the situation as quickly as it unraveled, tried to rebook, replan, rebuild, but her voice on the phone grew harsher, shorter, her fingers tapping restlessly on the countertop as she assured me that it's okay, it's just a coincidence. But we both knew it wasn't, and when she finally confronted her parents, it wasn't with anger, but with the jaded determination that comes after realizing you're no longer talking to people, but to masks too old to break. "I just want to understand why," she said one evening in the living room of their penthouse, where glass, silence, and artificial thermostat reigned supreme. "Why can't you be happy for me?" Margot didn't blink an eye. "Because happiness, Claire, is not the same as stability," she said in a voice like ice melted just enough to flow. "And we raised you to know the difference." William sipped his whiskey without taking his eyes off the newspaper. "Love is fine, dear," he added, "but inheritance is a delicate matter. Orchids don't get mud on them." Claire's lips parted, but no sound came out of them, just a sigh and disbelief. Later that night, when I returned to her apartment, the one we'd chosen together, not too far from the hospital and not too close to her family home, I found an envelope on the dresser. No name, no stamp, just heavy cream-colored paper and handwriting that tried too hard to look neat. I shouldn't have opened it, but I did open it. Inside, by her mother's hand, were 5 sentences that said everything they dared not say out loud. "Dear, you are marrying beneath yourself. This man, though admirable, will never understand your world and, worse, will resent it. We don't blame you for being rebellious, but we hope this is just a phase. Marrying a loser is still a failure, no matter how far he gets." I stood with the letter in my hands, my heart pounding not with rage but with clarity, because I couldn't pretend anymore it wasn't about manners or mismatched lifestyles or generational differences. It was about skin and class and fear masquerading as caring, about parents who would rather bury their daughter in diamonds than see her live in a world they couldn't control. I haven't gotten around to telling Claire. Not yet. Not that night. She was curled up on the couch, hair tucked up, glasses sliding down her nose. She was reading salesmen's contracts like a general preparing for war, and I couldn't bring myself to put another load on her shoulders. Not yet. But the next morning the load came anyway. Senator Anderson had invited Claire to breakfast. Private. Formal. He took her to an old members-only club near the park, with dark wood walls and brass plaques on every leather chair. And over scrambled eggs Benedict and imported espresso, laid out his proposal not as a threat, but as an investment portfolio. "If you cancel quietly," he said, buttering his toast with surgical precision, "we'll cover all expenses, make sure everything is taken care of. No questions, no scandal. Just redirection. You have your whole life ahead of you, Claire, and frankly, there are other men who could complete you." She stared at him, without blinking, without flinching, just staring. "Is it because of his race?" she asked finally, her voice as hard as a scalpel. He exhaled through his nose like a man frustrated by a question he considered beneath his dignity. "It's about form," he said. "About optics. About not confusing charity with compatibility." She stood up, walked away from the table, didn't touch her food, didn't say goodbye. And when she returned to the apartment, she said nothing, just went to the dresser, found the envelope, read the letter silently, then calmly, without ceremony, took out a match and lit it. It burned quickly, like dry paper soaked in gasoline. She watched it turn to ashes in the sink, then looked at me and said, "Now I know what I'm walking away from." I took her hand. Didn't say I was sorry. Didn't say I understood. Because I didn't. Not really. But I knew one thing. When a woman burns her inheritance for love, it's not just affection, real love. 2 days later, Claire received a letter inviting her to the Anderson estate. The strangest thing was that it came not in the form of a call or text, but a folded letter delivered by courier, embossed with the family crest. Like a warning carved in ivory, a subtle reminder that some bloodlines prefer paper to screens when they're about to deliver an ultimatum wrapped in etiquette. Thursday, 7 p.m. Just Claire, and though she held the envelope with the same care a man might show a live grenade, though every muscle in her face said she didn't want to go, I told her that sometimes it was better to walk through fire than to pretend it wasn't there, and she went, alone. And I stayed, pacing the apartment like a man waiting outside an operating room, knowing that what would happen within those walls would not be a conversation but a dismissal ceremony, a final attempt to wipe me off the face of the earth without ever saying my name. The dining room, she later told me, was furnished like a courtroom, faint candlelight, silver polished to a shine, wine glasses gleaming like scalpel blades, and in the center of it all was her mother Margot, sitting like a monarch dressed for mourning. With her arms folded in perfect posture, her voice silk and ice as she began, "Claire, we love you. That has never changed. But love sometimes requires difficult conversations," and Claire said nothing. Margot continued with a smile that cut people deeper than her daughter. "This choice you've made is an emotional one, and we understand that at your age emotions are running high, but marriage isn't just about feelings, it's about alignment, it's about culture, it's about aesthetics, and Claire, dear, let's be honest, the world is not as progressive as your heart." And while that sentence hung in the air like the faint scent of a dying man, Senator William Anderson leaned back in his chair, interlocked his fingers like a judge, preparing to make his closing statement, and said, "We've supported you in everything, education, travel, career, and now when we ask you to pause, just pause, you treat us like villains, even though all we're trying to do is protect what we've built. Because I've spent my life building a name that has power, and Marcus Reed, though I'm sure he's a hard worker and a fine man, does not belong to that legacy." And when she still said nothing, when her silence grew louder than their carefully chosen words, he continued, lowering his voice to something heavier, darker, adding, "He's not one of us, Claire, and he never will be, and the world knows it. Our colleagues know it, the press knows it, your future children will know it." She shuddered then, just a little bit. And that was all it took for Margot to strike with surgical ferocity. Can you imagine what it will be like for them? Not white enough for your friends, not black enough for his neighbors, forever caught in the middle, forever explaining who they are and why, never fully accepted anywhere. And though it seems noble to you now, believe me, you are setting them up for confusion, for resentment, for a life of trying to earn the love that should have gone to them without question. And those words so carefully honed, so elegantly vicious should have cut not her but me, and Claire, for all her strength, felt the blade stab into her. But what she did next made me love her more than I thought possible. She stood up, without raising her voice, without breaking a single detail of their impeccable etiquette, and she said, slowly, clearly, like a sentence carved in stone, "I'd rather my children learn to deal with pain than grow up in a house where poison is served in crystal glasses and called tradition." And Margot, whose entire life had been built on maintaining control, only lost her mask for a second, hissing, "You're going to regret this." But Claire didn't even look back, replying, "No, you will," and left the table that had raised her, funded her, and finally tried to erase her. When she returned, she didn't collapse or cry or ask for comfort, but went straight to her laptop, opened the wedding plan folder, deleted the contract with the original venue, canceled the guest list, called the florist, the caterer, the organizer, one by one, and told them their services were no longer needed, then opened a blank document, titled it, "Our Wedding is Real," and started from scratch. We moved the ceremony to an old greenhouse next to the hospital where I did my residency, not historic, not gilded, but filled with light and warmth and echoes of the life preserved within its worn walls. And when I asked if she wanted to let her parents know, she just shook her head and said, "They've made their choice," and then went to her bookshelf, pulled out a collection of rare art prints, put them in a box for sale, took off a vintage bracelet given to her by her grandmother, kissed it, and put it carefully in a little velvet pouch marked "For Sale." And when I tried to stop her, she looked at me with an unwavering gaze and said, "If that's the price of dignity, it's still a bargain." And in that moment, I saw not a girl who had been raised to inherit a name, but a woman determined to build her own, brick by brick, scar by scar, next to the person they never thought she would stand beside. That night, as we sat on the floor eating takeout, her bare feet tucked under my leg and her hair penciled up, she whispered, "I don't want a legacy to be built on their name. I want it to be built on the love we didn't run from," and I didn't say anything back. Because there are victories so quiet that they don't need a flag to prove they happened. They live in the silence you earn by standing up to a storm that should have brought you to your knees. And what do you think? They hadn't come to the new wedding, of course they hadn't. Not after Claire had canceled the original ceremony, not after she'd sold her inherited jewelry to pay off the vendors. Not after she'd canceled the string quartet and replaced it with a gospel ensemble that sang as if every note had been carved from the sky itself. Not after telling her mother that family is not defined by blood ties wrapped in money, but by the people who choose you when it costs them everything, and not after standing in front of her silent father and saying, "You won't walk me down the aisle if you can't walk beside the man I love," and not after he responded by sending back an invitation card torn in half, with the word, rejected, circled twice in red ink. As if it were a stain she should be ashamed of, not a badge she would wear with pride. They didn't come, but everyone else did. The nurses who worked double shifts with Marcus in emergency rooms with broken heaters and systems that didn't work. The kids from the community center where Claire volunteered on Saturdays. The elderly neighbors who brought folding chairs from home because they didn't want to miss the event. My surgical colleagues, the artists from Claire's work, and together we transformed the glass-roofed conservatory into something greater than any cathedral, a sanctuary of defiance, of rebirth, of truth that no longer asked permission. Marcus stood at the entrance in a deep navy blue suit, nothing flashy, but sewn from the inside out of the Ankara fabric his mother had given him the day before, the same one his grandfather wore when he crossed the ocean with only a note of prayers. And Claire walked down the aisle not in lace or satin, but in a sleek dress handmade by a black designer from Harlem. No corset, no veil, just fire in her gait and wildflowers in her hair. And when they met at the altar, they didn't cry, they didn't tremble, they just breathed together, as if the whole world held its breath to watch them exhale. And then the vows followed. Marcus didn't read from a card, didn't recite something he'd found on the internet. He looked at her with a hardness forged from every hospital floor he'd mopped as a teenager, from every scholarship he'd had to beg to earn, from every time someone had told him he spoke amazingly well, and said, "They told me I had to change to be worthy of you. They told me to soften my voice, but I'm not here to be easy, Claire. I'm here because you saw me before they tried to rewrite me. And I vow to never shrink back into a room again, not for them, not for anyone. I vow to build a life with you that doesn't just stand up to judgment, but defies it." And Claire, she didn't blink, she didn't switch, she didn't lower her voice to be more pleasant. She looked past the crowd, past the stained glass windows, as if looking directly into the absence of her parents, and spoke. "I was raised to believe that love should look a certain way, sound a certain way, come with approval and a polished resume. But then I met you and realized that legacy isn't what you inherit, it's what you fight for, what you build with skin knees, calluses on your hands, and a spine that won't bend. And that's why I gave up their money, their name, their inheritance, all of it. And I'm not afraid because what we build doesn't have to be inherited, it has to be earned. And I swear that no matter how loud the world gets, I will always listen to your silence first." There was no applause. Not for the first time. Just silence. Thick and holy. And then someone stood up. Then another. And another. Until the whole room was on its feet, not clapping but standing, like witnesses to something sacred, something that needed no affirmation, something that stood in opposition to every lie money had ever told about love. Outside, the wind picked up. Marcus leaned forward and whispered something only she could hear. She smiled and kissed him, not like a fairy tale, not like an ending, but like a beginning forged in fire. And somewhere far, far away, in a house filled with silence and silver, two people who used to think they had everything in their hands finally realized that they were no longer watched, no longer pursued, no longer feared. They were forgotten. Because it wasn't their story anymore. It never was. It was Claire's story. It was Marcus' story. It was the story of two people who looked the world in the eye and said, "You don't get to decide who we are." And the world, for the first time ever, finally quieted down.